With the attributes and weapon types of the version 3.0 characters being officially announced, as well as the announcement of the fact that Toon Break will become a permanent combat mechanic, there is a lot of speculation to be had about what the new characters will do. And while I've already done a speculation video about both these characters in the past, I would like to talk about them one more time because we just have so much more new information. Starting with Lynae, because she is going to be the first character that's coming. A lot of what I thought still stands true to this day. I still believe Lynae is going to end up being a DPS character. And she still is a Spectro character, so those things were still correct. However, because I was unaware of the fact that Toon Break would become a permanent combat mechanic, a lot of what I said in that video ended up having a lot less weight. I primarily talked about what her damage type would be and what I would like to see from her DPS playstyle. But now that we have Toon Break, I think that there's a lot more interesting things that could be done with Lynae. There are still some things that are not very sure about Toon Break. For example, is the damage going to be based off of your character? Is each character going to have independent multipliers for their Toon Breaks? And most importantly, is Toon Break getting its own damage bonus, or will the Toon Breaks of characters be counted as other types of damage? For example, will Zani's Toon Break be Spectrofrazzle damage, or will it get its own Toon Break damage instead? I believe Toon Break in this way will be handled similarly to negative status, at least in Zani's case. Zani's attacks count as Spectrofrazzle and heavy attack damage, so they are two damage types. I believe that Toon Break will get its own damage types, and that for most characters, Toon Break will simply deal Toon Break damage. However, for characters that specialize in Toon Break, like maybe Lynae, their Toon Break will be able to scale on additional stats. For example, Lynae's Toon Break would count as both Toon Break damage as well as Liberation damage, for example. And despite what you think, we would still avoid the Zani scenario. At least assuming that any Toon Break supports will have regular scaling on their outro skill and not the 100% that negative statuses get, because that is one of the biggest issue with negative status DPSs. The outro skills are simply too strong, and thus if you do not have the premium support, you run into a big issue. This, combined with the application issues, is why negative status is, in my opinion, so horribly designed. But since we already know that Toon Break is going to be able to be applied by every single character, that means that at least one of the two issues of negative status isn't going to be there. This only leaves us with the outro skill scaling question, which that's entirely in Kuro's court. I can't really make any predictions based on that for now. But hopefully they decide to go the regular route, where Toon Break based outro skills will have the same scaling as, for example, a Yuno outro skill or a Yinlin outro skill. That way you're still able to use any other liberation buffers with Lynae, and then there's just going to be a Toon Break based buffer that is her best in slot. As for how they would integrate Toon Break into the character's kit, I believe that there's two ways to do this. Either give the character very high off-tune application, so this way the character is able to trigger Toon Break an absolute ton, or alternatively, what I like more, making a character that is able to force a Toon Break skill. For example, let's look at Dialin from Zenless Zone Zero. She is able to force a chain attack prompt with one of her attacks. This is one of Zenless's most unique mechanics, and is usually only reserved for stun rotations. However, Dialin allows you to use it either way. So perhaps a Toon Break skill-based DPS like Lynae would be able to in some way force herself to use a Toon Break skill. Perhaps using her forte, she is able to force a Toon Break skill, and then she'll be able to get an additional Toon Break skill naturally. And then whenever she is not using her Toon Break skills, she is simply going to be doing regular damage like all the other DPSs in the game, like Liberation damage for example. This would also mean that she isn't too reliant on a Toon Break based sub-DPS, which would be very nice. But that's enough talking about Lynae. I find Mornye to be a way more interesting character to talk about in this video, because I had simply no idea what Mornye was going to do. I did speculate that 3.0 would bring a new mechanic and that Mornye would specialize in this mechanic. And now we finally know what the mechanic in question is, and it's going to be Toon Break. I believe Mornye is going to be our first Toon Break focused support or sub DPS character who wants to lift up all the Toon Break based characters. Realistically, she's going to be the best in slot for Lynae, and then she's going to be good for all other Toon Break DPSs, But I suspect that the other Toon Break carries are going to get their own sub-DPSs. Or maybe it becomes a Yuno situation where she's built for Lynae, but she ends up being the best in slot for all the others as well. I wouldn't know. So what would make Mornye the best in slot sub-DPS for Toon Break DPS characters? I believe that, much like my idea for Lynae, something that Mornye could do is simply increase the amount of off-tune that your team applies. This would be very good for a primarily Toon Break based sub-DPS, because while she wouldn't be doing much Toon Break damage herself, she would still be assisting the team in getting as much Toon Break damage out there as possible. If my idea of Toon Breaks having additional damage types attached to them is true, having a simple 50% Toon Break damage outro skill is not going to be enough to really be the definitive best in slot, especially when we have such powerful sub-DPSs like Yuno and Lupa, who deal such massive damage and give such a large amount of buffs. So Mornye would need to have some things in her kit that make her specifically good for Toon Break. Choyuan was in a very similar situation. He had to compete with Lupa in order to be the best in slot character for Galbrenna, and in order to make him actually win that matchup, they gave him more buffs that were dedicated to echo damage. So I believe that Mornye is going to be very similar, where she's going to have mechanics that are specifically tailored towards Toon Break. And what better way to do this than to give her the ability to increase the amount of off-tune your characters apply, thus meaning you're going to get more Toon Breaks out of your characters, and thus that means more Toon Break skills, and more Toon Break skills also means that you're able to use any Toon Break buffing that Mornye gives even more. I suspect that her outro skill is going to give 50% Toon Break damage amplification, being in line with characters like Choyuan and Yuno. Because Lynae and Mornye have different elements, she cannot be an element plus damage type buffer, because, well, she would need to buff fusion, which Lynae doesn't do, and I really do believe that Lynae and Mornye are going to synergize as the first real Toon Break core. So that only makes sense. I also believe that Mornye is going to have additional damage buffs for Toon Breaks in her kit. Maybe an additional 30% crit damage to Toon Break specifically, or maybe 30% Toon Break damage bonus. That simply just makes sense to me. I also believe that Lynae is going to increase the amount of off-tune your characters will be capable of applying, thus allowing for more Toon Breaks within your rotation. If I was making a new mechanic within my game like Toon Break, I would want as many players to be able to experience it as possible. So for those who wouldn't want to get Lynae, they wouldn't be able to really experiment much with Toon Break unless they got Mornye. So I would really want Mornye to hone in on allowing your other teams to utilize Toon Break, thus making her maybe an option for other teams, but never really best in slot unless it's a dedicated Toon Break DPS. And since other DPSs will not be built around having Toon Break in their kits, that means they would need to have a character that would help them actually get Toon Break skills. And Mornye would be the best possible choice for this, since she is also in the version 3.0 update, and if she ends up being a Toon Break focused sub-DPS like I am imagining, I believe she would be the best fit for giving a buff like this. But those are just my opinions. Let me know what you think of Toon Break being incorporated into character kits down in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, you should join my Discord server, which is linked down in the description. If you just want to see more of me, you can also check a different link in the description to check out my second channel. But that'll be all from me. Peace.